I think you need to know the truth.
Alright, I'm just gonna say it. One Piece is trash. And before you start typing your 400-word essay about you don't understand peak fiction, relax. We're gonna discuss this like gentlemen, you and me. And the fact that I still consider you one, that's generosity. And after that, whatever happens, happens. Maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? Let's see. Welcome to Me Abinabaur. And today, we're going to talk about One Piece. First of all, I actually like the name, One Piece, because it perfectly describes the One Piece its fans are missing. A brain, and this is how I imagine the average One Piece fan. No thoughts, just drums and copy. But jokes aside, let me explain how this started. Like most of us, I didn't discover anime on some elite read forum. We were kids. We watched whatever was on TV. That's how I found One Piece. I remember reaching the Arabasta arc, and even back then, I was like, hey, it's cool, but why this fight is taking 3 business days? Then I grow up, and suddenly I hear One Piece is fake fiction, it's the greatest story even written, better than everything. I was shocked. Like, what? It was good, but that good? So I said, fine, let me restart it. From episode 1, and bro, I couldn't even reach Arabasta again. Meanwhile, I'm watching stuff like Death Note, Attack on Titan, Tokyo Ghoul, and I'm thinking, this is pacing, this is tension, this is stakes. And then I go back to One Piece, and it feels like I'm watching a pirate filler documentary. But you know what? I'm stubborn. So after multiple failed attempts, I told myself, no, this time you're finishing it. And I did, after I think 2 years or something. And let me tell you something, watching it felt like doing homework for a class I never signed up for. It wasn't excitement, it was obligation. And now that I'm done, I'm tired of pretending. If people think it's peak, then it's finally time to talk. Now that I told you my history with One Piece, I'm going to use a very simple technique. I will start with the less important problems and slowly move towards the biggest issue. Why? Because I want you to stay until the end. Yes, I'm using the same manipulation techniques your favorite anime uses. So let's start with something simple, the pacing, which is already a huge problem, especially for new viewers. One Piece has more pacing problems than your entire life. Seriously, sometimes the pacing feels more Indian than Indian movies themselves. Characters stare at each other for 10 minutes, someone throws one punch, and suddenly we're watching a flashback from 2004. And the craziest part, this anime has 1000 plus episodes and it's still not finished. At this point, it feels like Ichiro Oda discovered the ultimate business model. Keep the story moving just slow enough so the fans never leave, while the money keeps flowing. Honestly, sometimes it feels like One Piece isn't chasing the treasure. The treasure is chasing the fans' wallet. And that's a strong start, right? Because if the first problem is already this bad, imagine what's coming next. Now let's talk about something that should be the best part of any shonen anime, the fights. And honestly, I just don't like the fights in One Piece. They feel like they're still using a manga fighting format instead of anime. What do I mean? One character throws a punch, the camera cuts, then we see the other character reacting to that punch in another scene. Then another cut. Then another reaction shot. It's like the characters are fighting in different universes. Half of the time you don't even see both fighters in the same frame. Now compare that to fights in Naruto. Thousands of characters, and yet the main crew always goes through the most dangerous situations imaginable without even a scratch. You already know the outcome. There is no tension, there is no fear, and there is no real stake. And the funny thing that Ichiro Oda once said he doesn't like bringing characters back from the dead like Dragon Ball Z does, because he wants the story to feel realistic. Realistic? Brother, he didn't make that meaningful. He removed it entirely. Your characters aren't resurrected, they're just immortal from the start. They're. And another thing. Yes, another thing. Why does every arc in One Piece feels longer than BBC? Seriously, some arcs feels like they will never end. You start the arc, there is an introduction, then a flashback, then another flashback, then 20 side characters, then 12 separate fights happening at the same time. And suddenly you realize you've spent 3 months watching the same island. At this point, it doesn't feel like storytelling anymore. It feels like the show is stretching time itself. Whoa, and the power scaling, that's another thing, which honestly makes no sense. Characters beat insanely powerful enemies and then struggle against someone who should be much more weaker. The strengths of characters change depending on what the plot needs that week. And when that happens too often, the fights stop feeling logical. They just feel scripted. For example, Enel is introduced as godlike villain in the Skypia. He has one of the most broken devil fruits in the series, the Goro Goro Nomi, literally turning into lightning and wiping out entire areas instantly. Monkey D. Luffy defeats him. Okay, so logically, Luffy just beat someone with island level power. But right after that, in the Long Ring Long Land arc, if I say that right, Luffy struggles against a joke of a villain whose ability is basically slowing people down with beam. So Luffy goes from defeating a lightning god to struggling in a goofy pirate game. Well, you can say that this was a filler arc. Okay, I believe you. Okay, no problem. I'll give you another example. Crocodile loses to Luffy in the Arabasta arc. At that point, Luffy doesn't even have height, he just punches Crocodile with blood and water. But later, in the Marineford arc, Crocodile suddenly clutches with top-tier character, even confronting fighters like Draco Mayhawk during the Summit War of Marine. So the same guy who lost to a pre-gear Luffy suddenly looks competitive among the strongest fighters in the world. Then we got Rob Lucci. In the Enies Lobby arc, Luffy beats Lucci after an extreme fight. Lucci was supposed to be the ultimate assassin of CP9. But later in the Egghead arc, Lucci comes back as a part of CP0. And suddenly he can fight evenly with Renoir Zoro, who by that point is right-hand man of Ayonko. Remember that, Ayonko, by the way. And even Luffy, now officially one of the 4 emperors, still has to put effort into dealing with him. Which raises a simple question. Who did Lucci beat to justify that jump? No legendary pirates, no emperor, no warlord. Meanwhile, Luffy's record includes victories over people like Crocodile, Rob Lucci, Don Quixote Don Flamingo, Charlotte Katakuri, and eventually even Kaido. So, narratively, Luffy's growth makes sense, but Lucci coming back and suddenly hanging with Yonko level fighter, that feels less like natural scaling and more like the story reviving old villains because they are popular, everything. Now let's talk about the Shanks arm situation. And here's another funny example of how fans sometimes overanalyze everything. Remember when Shanks lost his arm at the beginning of the story? People now say, oh, that was a genius plan by Ichiro Oda. It shows how deep the story was from the start. But even Oda himself said he didn't originally plan for Shanks to become that powerful. It was just an early story moment. But fans sometimes treat every small detail like it was a 500 IQ master plan. Sometimes a scene is just a scene. Not every moment is hidden genius. And that's another thing that makes criticizing One Piece difficult. Because the fans will always say, no bro, you just don't understand the masterpiece. And finally, every arc feels the same. The crew arrive at a new island. Something strange happens. The group gets separated by some random event or hidden power. They explore the island. They learn about the local conflicts. Then everything builds up to the exact same structure. Zoro fights the enemy leader's right-hand man. Sanji fights the second strongest. Monkey D. Luffy fights the main villain. The rest of the crew handles the leftover enemies. The villain is defeated. The island is saved. everyone celebrates, and then the crew sails away to the next island, where the same structure repeats again. And one more thing that always bothers this show is supposed to be about pirates, but the last time I checked, pirates weren't heroes. Historically, pirates robbed ships, stole treasure, and killed innocent people. They were criminals. That's literally what made pirates' stories interesting. The danger, the greed, the chaos of the sea. But in One Piece, most pirates behave more like superheroes than pirates. They save civilians, they liberate islands, they defeat tyrants, they protect innocent people. At the point, they're not pirates anymore. And I thought that this show was about pirates. You see it in arcs like the Arabasta arc, the Dressrosa arc, and even parts of the Wano Country arcs. Different settings, different villain, but the same formula. So after looking at everything, the inconsistent power scaling, the repetitive arc structure, characters that often feel underwritten, and moments that don't always make logical sense. For me, a lot of One Piece just doesn't work. Meanwhile, a series like Attack on Titan goes in almost the opposite direction. Its story consistently evolves, the mysteries build on each other, and the world feels tightly constructed. But I will say this. There is one thing in One Piece that I actually like. The background story. The idea that world government hides truth, that history has been erased, that people are being controlled and brainwashed, and that pirates like Monkey D. Luffy are fighting for freedom in a corrupted world. That bigger mystery about the Void Century and the true history, that part is genuinely and honestly, it's probably the main thing that keeps people invested in the story. So after everything I said, do you still see One Piece the same way? Thanks for watching, and go ahead, send this video to your One Piece worshipping friend, and let's see what they say.